Princess Anne is reportedly annoyed with Prince William for skipping key royal duties.
Revealing a crisis surrounding Prince Louis.
That Anne
Her
still
intervention,
does investitures
driven by
because
past
the Prince of Wales
experiences,
doesn't want to do
highlighted
them,
a growing
adding,
concern.
It annoys her.
The palace,
Despite
initially
turning
masking the
75
issue
next
with
month, Anne
omissions
continues
and
to
silence,
take on the
had
bulk of
shifted
royal
communications,
engagements,
causing alarm.
474
And,
last year
bypassing
alone,
official channels,
earning her title
directly
of the
contacted
monarchy's
William,
hardest working
urging
royal.
Louis's
But
removal
don't
from
expect
public
a flashy
scrutiny.
birthday bash.
This act,
She's marking the
defying
milestone with a
institutional norms,
€5 coin
sparked
from the royal
controversy.
mint and a
A
low-key
confidential
sailing
memo
trip with her
prioritizing
husband,
reputational
Sir Timothy
damage
Lawrence,
control over
just
Louis's
how she
well-being.
likes it.
To understand why Princess Anne allegedly reached her breaking point, we need to rewind. Before the headlines, before the documentaries, before the lawsuits, and before the carefully curated victim narrative hardened into doctrine. Because according to royal commentators, this scandal did not explode overnight. It fermented quietly, behind palace walls, in briefing folders no one outside the inner circle was ever meant to see. Princess Anne has long been described by palace watchers as the royal family's reality check. She is not sentimental, she does not indulge fantasy, and she does not speak unless she believes silence is more dangerous than truth. That is why insiders say her alleged intervention now has sent shockwaves through royal circles. This wasn't emotional, it was procedural, and that distinction matters. At the center of this controversy is Prince Harry, a man who, for years, has framed his departure from royal life as an escape from cruelty, rigidity, and institutional coldness. But critics argue that narrative conveniently omits one uncomfortable detail. Multiple senior royals, Anne included, reportedly raised concerns long before the exit ever happened. Not about love, not about race, but about structure, consequences, and long-term risk. According to sources familiar with internal discussions, Anne's concern was never personal. It was systemic. She allegedly viewed Harry's trajectory not as rebellion, but as destabilization, financial, reputational, and diplomatic. And as events unfolded, commentators now claim those concerns look less like pessimism and more like foresight. Publicly, the Sussex era has been sold as empowerment. Privately, royal analysts say it looked increasingly like erosion. Contracts announced with cinematic flair, deals framed as groundbreaking, projects teased as transformative. Yet behind the scenes, industry insiders began whispering about underperformance, missed benchmarks, and shifting goalposts. And those whispers, sources claim, did not go unnoticed by the palace. Princess Anne, by reputation, does not react to headlines. She reacts to patterns. And the pattern that allegedly alarmed her most was not media criticism, it was volatility. Sudden spending, expanding security demands, escalating legal battles, a lifestyle scaled for permanence without a foundation guaranteed to sustain it. This is where royal observers say the tone inside the family shifted, because when personal choices begin generating institutional risk, they stop being personal. According to commentators, Anne reportedly believed Harry was mistaking visibility for leverage and publicity for protection. In royal terms, that is a dangerous miscalculation. Then came the public accusations, interviews that named names without naming specifics, claims that hinted broadly but proved narrowly, statements that ignited outrage while avoiding verifiable detail. To supporters, this was bravery. To critics, it was a scorched earth strategy. And to Anne, sources allege, it was the moment concern became alarm. Royal insiders describe Anne as deeply loyal, to the crown, not comfort. From her perspective, commentators argue, the monarchy does not survive on feelings, it survives on restraint, discipline, and the slow burn of credibility. When those pillars are compromised, the damage is generational. What made matters worse, analysts say, was the expectation of rescue. Time and again, Harry's camp appeared to assume that royal ties could still function as a safety net, financially, reputationally, symbolically. But Anne has always opposed that model. You exit, you exit. You criticize, you detach. You do not cash checks while throwing stones. This alleged philosophical divide is critical to understanding what happened next, because while Harry framed his choices as independence, Anne reportedly saw dependence without accountability, and in institutions, that is intolerable. As tensions escalated, observers note that silence from senior royals became conspicuous. No rebuttals, no clarifications, no counter-narratives. To the public, this looked like weakness, but royal historians point out that silence has always been the monarchy's pressure chamber. Let the weight build, let contradictions surface, let reality speak. Behind closed doors, however, sources claim Anne was tracking outcomes: viewership versus credibility, revenue versus liability, sympathy versus fatigue. And according to commentators, the data told a story Harry did not want to hear. Support began thinning, industry alliances cooled, legal victories failed to materialize as expected, the press cycle turned repetitive, the narrative hardened, not in Harry's favor, but against him. At that point, insiders say Anne allegedly concluded that intervention, however unwelcome, was overdue. This is where reports diverge, but the theme remains consistent. Anne did not attack, she assessed. She allegedly outlined risks already incurred and risks still coming. She reportedly made it clear that emotional framing would not alter structural consequences, and she is said to have warned that public sympathy is not infinite. For Harry, commentators speculate, this was devastating, not because it was cruel, but because it stripped away illusion. He had believed the story would hold, that the audience would remain captive, that the institution would eventually bend. Anne's alleged stance suggested the opposite. The institution was waiting him out. And that is the moment, royal watchers say, when the tone changed. Not publicly, internally. Because once the palace accepts that reconciliation is unlikely, strategy replaces sentiment, containment replaces negotiation, and legacy replaces relationship. As the scandal narrative intensified in the media, Anne's silence grew louder, until, according to sources, it didn't. Not in front of cameras, not in interviews, but in words delivered with finality to those who needed to hear them most. And it is at this exact point, when warning turns into reckoning, when patience becomes posture, and when Harry is forced to confront the possibility that the system he fought may be the only one that ever protected him, that the story does not pause. Sources familiar with palace dynamics claim that once Princess Anne concluded Harry would not reverse course, the focus quietly shifted from reconciliation to containment. This is a crucial distinction. Containment does not mean punishment. It means minimizing fallout. It means limiting exposure. And most importantly, it means refusing to participate in a narrative you believe will eventually collapse under its own contradictions. Royal analysts say Anne has always believed that institutions outlast individuals, but only if individuals are allowed to face the consequences of their choices without intervention. In that sense, Harry's situation was not unique. What made it explosive was the scale, the publicity, and the expectation of immunity. Behind the scenes, insiders allege a detailed assessment began circulating among senior aides. Not gossip, not emotion, but metrics. Media saturation versus public trust, revenue announcements versus deliverables, legal aggression versus tangible wins. And according to commentators, the results were deeply uncomfortable. While public statements framed success, internal evaluations reportedly showed diminishing returns. Projects announced with cinematic urgency quietly stalled. Partnerships touted as historic began to shrink in scope, and the louder the claims became, the thinner the substantiation appeared. To Anne's camp, this wasn't injustice, it was inevitability. Royal watchers point out that Anne has lived through multiple royal crises, divorces, scandals, exiles. She understands one brutal truth: the public forgives silence faster than spectacle, and Harry, critics argue, chose spectacle every time. As this pattern hardened, sources claim the palace grew increasingly concerned about escalation, not because of embarrassment, but because of unpredictability. The Sussex strategy, analysts say, relied heavily on emotional leverage, but emotional leverage only works when the audience stays emotionally invested. Once fatigue sets in, the leverage evaporates. This is where the alleged tension sharpened. Harry, by many accounts, believed momentum was on his side, that each revelation, each accusation, each media appearance would force the palace to respond. But Anne, insiders claim, saw something else entirely: diminishing shock value. And in media economics, diminishing shock is fatal. Public reaction began to split, not cleanly, but noticeably. Sympathy curdled into skepticism. Support morphed into exhaustion. Even neutral observers began asking uncomfortable questions, not who's right, but why is this still happening? That shift, commentators argue, is what made Anne's position unmovable, because once public curiosity turns into weariness, any institution that reacts looks defensive, and defense implies weakness. Meanwhile, industry insiders began leaking their own frustrations. Anonymous sources questioned timelines, executives quietly distanced themselves, legal experts publicly poked holes in sweeping claims. None of this required palace orchestration. It unfolded organically. And to Anne, that organic unraveling was proof that silence was working. Harry, however, was allegedly unprepared for that reality. According to royal psychologists and biographers, he has always operated from a place of moral urgency. Act now, speak loudly, control the story. But institutions do not move at the speed of outrage. They move at the speed of endurance. As the months dragged on, sources claim Harry expected a breakthrough that never came, a decisive apology, a public concession, a reversal. Instead, he received procedural distance, doors not slammed, but quietly closed. And this is where commentators say the emotional toll became visible, because when anger no longer provokes reaction, it turns inward. Insiders describe Harry as increasingly isolated, not geographically, but strategically. Allies hesitated, advisors softened language, even supportive voices began urging de-escalation. That advice, sources claim, clashed directly with Harry's self-image. He did not see himself as escalating, he saw himself as persisting. Anne, on the other hand, allegedly saw a man mistaking repetition for progress. At some point, exact timing remains disputed. Sources say Anne's message was finally delivered, not publicly, not theatrically, but clearly. The era of expectation was over. The monarchy would not respond, it would not negotiate through media, and it would not intervene financially, reputationally, or strategically. For Harry, commentators speculate, this landed not as policy, but as abandonment. Yet Anne's defenders argue the opposite. They say she believed continued rescue would infantilize him, not save him, that real independence requires consequences. This philosophical divide is the heart of the scandal. Not money, not titles, not even accusations, but a fundamental disagreement about adulthood. Royal historians note that Anne herself rejected comfort for duty decades ago. She chose responsibility over applause, stability over validation. In her worldview, hardship is not cruelty, it is formation. Harry, by contrast, has consistently framed hardship as injustice. That framing worked when he was young. It inspired sympathy. But as an adult, demanding institutional accommodation, it began to grate. And this is why Anne's alleged stance carries such weight. She is not perceived as political, she is not media savvy. She gains nothing from conflict, which is precisely why when she speaks, directly or indirectly, people listen. By the time rumors of Harry being in tears began circulating, royal commentators say the emotional damage was already done. Because tears do not come from a single moment. They come from realization, from the understanding that the system you challenged did not break and will not bend. What makes this moment particularly painful, analysts suggest, is that Harry now faces a paradox. The palace he accused of cruelty is the only entity capable of ending the cycle. But by design, it will not step in unless he steps back. And that realization, according to those watching closely, is where the story pivots again. Because once anger collapses into grief, the next phase is not retaliation. By this stage, commentators say Prince Harry was no longer fighting the palace, he was fighting gravity. The weight of time, the weight of consequence, and the weight of the realization that no press release could undo. Sources close to royal circles describe this period as the moment Harry finally understood that the monarchy had not been engaging him at all. It had been waiting for the cycle to exhaust itself, waiting for contradictions to surface, waiting for the public to grow tired of perpetual outrage. And once that happened, the palace did not need to act. Reality did the work for them. Princess Anne's alleged role in this final phase was not dramatic, but decisive. Insiders say she pushed for a single guiding principle: no retaliation, no reward, no rescue. Let outcomes speak. Let time do what emotion cannot. This is where the idea of global fallout begins to make sense, not as a single catastrophic event, but as a slow erosion. Royal analysts point out that fallout doesn't arrive with sirens, it arrives with silence from former allies, hesitance from institutions, and doors that close politely but permanently. By now, Harry's public positioning had shifted. The anger softened, the language became reflective. But reflection, critics argue, came too late, because reflection without accountability reads as regret, not repair. Meanwhile, palace insiders say Anne was already thinking in decades, not news cycles. Her concern was legacy damage, not headline damage. How does this story age? How does it read 20 years from now? Who looks volatile? Who looks stable? And in that long view, she reportedly believed Harry was losing ground. One of the most brutal elements of this reckoning, commentators suggest, is isolation. Not physical isolation, but narrative isolation. When the story stops evolving, the protagonist becomes trapped inside it. Harry had told his truth, repeatedly, loudly, and yet somehow the world stopped responding. That silence is what sources say broke him, because silence is not opposition, silence is dismissal. Royal psychologists have long noted that Harry's identity has been deeply tied to reaction. From childhood, his pain generated response, media attention, family intervention, public sympathy. But when pain no longer produces reaction, it destabilizes the self. Anne, by all accounts, understood this risk, but she also believed that cushioning it would only delay the inevitable. In her worldview, growth comes when the noise stops. As whispers of Harry being in tears circulated, palace watchers cautioned against misinterpretation. These were not tears of guilt, they argued, but tears of realization. The realization that the story he told did not end the way he expected, that the villain did not collapse, that the audience did not riot, that the system endured. And endurance is the monarchy's greatest weapon. What makes this moment particularly stark is the contrast. On one side, a man still emotionally mid-conflict. On the other, an institution already post-conflict. Anne, commentators say, had already moved on, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. By this point, insiders claim even sympathetic royals had accepted that reconciliation would require something Harry was not yet prepared to give: silence. Not temporary silence, sustained silence, the kind that feels like erasure to someone who equates voice with survival. And this is where the tragedy sharpens. Harry did not lose because he spoke, he lost because he never stopped. Anne's alleged final position was not punitive, it was philosophical. You cannot demand institutional protection while attacking institutional legitimacy. You cannot monetize grievance and then request mercy. And you cannot weaponize exposure without eventually being exposed yourself, not by enemies, but by time. Royal commentators argue that this is why no dramatic counterattack ever came, no lawsuit, no press briefing, no public shaming, because the palace understood something Harry did not. Escalation validates, silence starves. As the dust settles, analysts say Harry is now left with a narrowing set of options: double down and risk further fatigue, retreat and risk irrelevance, or reset entirely. And that reset would require acknowledging that Anne was not cruel, she was correct. That admission, observers suggest, may be the hardest of all, because to accept Anne's warning is to accept that the pain was not inflicted, but chosen, that the door was not slammed, but walked past, and that the system he framed as hostile may have been the only one trying to slow him down before he ran out of road. In royal history, there is a pattern. Those who leave loudly often return quietly, or not at all. Anne has seen this before. She has no interest in spectacle, only stability. And so the scandal, at its core, is not about anger or betrayal. It is about timing, about a man realizing too late that the institution he tried to outrun had already reached the finish line. As observers look on, one question hangs heavier than all the rest: not whether Harry was right, not whether Anne was harsh, but whether this reckoning marks an end or merely the calm before a much deeper silence. And that question is now left not to the palace, but to the public. Was this a rare moment of honesty from inside the royal walls, or was it the beginning of something the palace has been trying to bury for years? Princess Anne didn't stumble into this. She didn't misspeak. She didn't accidentally reveal anything. This was controlled, precise, and devastating. When someone who has survived decades inside the royal machine finally speaks with this level of force, it's not noise, it's a warning. A warning that the fairy tale is cracking and the silence is no longer guaranteed. And Harry? If even half of what insiders are whispering is true, then the emotional collapse we're seeing isn't just about family drama, it's about exposure. It's about realizing that the protection he once relied on is gone. No safety net, no shield, just consequences. So now we ask you, who do you believe? Is Princess Anne protecting the monarchy from an even bigger disaster? Or is she drawing a line and saying enough is enough? And let's be honest, if this much is coming out now, what's still being hidden? What reports haven't leaked yet? What conversations happened behind closed doors that we'll never hear unless someone else breaks ranks? Observers note that this reckoning forces a deeper examination of Prince Harry's choices. Every public statement, every Netflix special, every interview or book excerpt now sits under the unforgiving light of Anne's philosophical warning. To some, Harry's path appeared liberating, heroic even, a modern prince daring to challenge centuries of tradition. But insiders whisper that what seemed freedom may have been something else entirely: exposure without strategy. Every reveal that Harry orchestrated now reads as a transaction he didn't fully understand, a chess move made without seeing the board in its entirety. Royal analysts argue that Anne's measured silence and precise positioning are part of a centuries-old playbook. The palace doesn't always act with speed or spectacle, but when it does, the impact is absolute. There is a lesson here. The institution tolerates challenges, but it does not tolerate errors of judgment. By the time Harry realized the stakes, the system had already calculated its response, leaving him caught between expectation and consequence. Anonymous palace sources suggest that the hidden letters and classified communications circulating in whispers are more than ceremonial. They are warnings encoded in a language only those who understand palace operations can fully decipher. Each note, each memo, each off-record conversation reportedly carries layers of meaning, signaling both approval and limits. And Harry, he may have misread them all. The emotional weight of this realization, as insiders describe it, is profound. Tears alone cannot convey the depth of a man understanding that the frameworks he once challenged were not arbitrary chains, they were protective scaffolding. By ignoring them, he may have stepped into the arena unshielded, exposed not by malice, but by circumstance. The public reaction, predictably, is a storm. Social media channels erupt with theories, leaked screenshots, and clips from past interviews, each dissected with surgical precision. Analysts watch as the narrative fractures. Some paint Harry as a martyr, others as a reckless idealist. Yet beneath the online chaos lies a quieter, more chilling consensus. Anne's move wasn't impulsive.